Today we're going to go through the Winawer French, the position on the board in front of us, which arises from the French defense e4, e6, and after the main move knight c3, where we play bishop to b4 and pin the knight. There's going to be some very strategically rich positions. It's quite well known that the Winawer French was a line that Bobby Fischer struggled with quite a bit in his playing career, because these positions after a3, bishop c3, b3 obviously have a lot of imbalance, where on the one hand, if white can get the bishop very active, this unopposed bishop can cause a lot of problems. But white also has doubled pawns, and the position is somewhat closed in the center, which kind of allows white to get away a little bit with some, with giving up the dark squared bishop. Now, what I'll do as usual is I'll kind of start with the main lines and work our way towards some of the sidelines, but either way, you are going to have plenty of ideas with both sides by the end of this video, so sit back and enjoy. The old main line here is to play the move of queen to g4, and it sort of exploits one of the disadvantages, let's say, of not having the dark squared bishop, is that this pawn can come under fire. But black does have some ideas in turn, and the move of queen c7 is sort of the main line, the Winawer poison pawn variation, which can lead to some very sharp play after, say, rook queen g7, rook g8, even though white is currently up a pawn. Of course, the threat of queen takes c3 is something that white needs to deal with. And after knight to e2, black plays knight bc6, and these lines can get quite sharp. Obviously, we can't go into all the details in a 10-minute video, but just to kind of give you the basic conclusion, essentially, after queen d3, in the old days I used to play bishop d7 and kind of just be a little bit worse, but it turns out that the move d4 is actually quite a reliable equalizer, where you kind of sacrifice this d-pawn. But on the other hand, you do save the c3 pawn, which is kind of a pawn in their face right now. And it's also not so easy for white to complete their development, because we got pressure on this pawn stopping the f1 bishop developing. Bishop e3 is going to run in a knight f5. And so if they play rook g1 to try to develop their bishop, well, we can go knight f5 and again just make it really hard for white to really consolidate and complete their development. And it just turns out that black is basically just doing fine in a position like this if they play it correctly. It is true that because this line is just such a very clear-cut and worked-out equalizer for black, that some players have been trying ideas like h4, trying to move the pawn down the board. Also, knight c3 is another move that's been explored, but it turns out black will get quite reasonable counterplay in these instances as well, even if white perhaps is going to be a little bit better in these positions with perfect play, but it's a topic a bit beyond the scope of the video. But if you are enjoying the coverage so far, do make sure to hit that like button. If you are new to the channel, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. And yeah, with that, I'll just wrap up the coverage of the Winawer poison pawn, because, well, there are moves like Tal's king d1 that can lead to some interesting positions. Also, queen d3 is another idea that can lead to some interesting endgames, potentially. But overall, black is generally doing okay in these lines, as long as I know a little bit of theory. And actually, there are also some alternatives where white can also play moves such as bishop d3, where rather than, let's say, black are sacrificing pawns, it's kind of white more sacrificing the pawns for an initiative in this instance. So a bit of a different way to play it. But okay, of course, quite a legitimate approach for white as well to try to go for an advantage with stuff like this, using the power of the bishop pair and the passed h-pawn. It is true black can also play the move c4 and just go for a much more locked up type position. But these positions the Indians tend to think are very strong for white, so yeah, probably cd4 is the approach that's a better way to play against bishop d3, which, if you prefer to attack rather than defend, yeah, this line that Nagy recommended a decade ago, can definitely be suggested. Now, I think that black's alternatives to either queen d7 or a move like cd4, which kind of tries to, transpose into these sort of queen g7 lines while trying to negate bishop d3 to some extent. I think black's alternatives don't really entirely work. Like if you play, say, castles here, this is sort of like the old main line where they go castles and try to, hit back in the center. The problem though is that in these arising positions, white just gets very easy play with the bishop pair. And this little tricky move of queen h5 just provokes this weakening g6 where you just again have these problems with the dark squares are just very hard to resolve, which is why you don't really see this sort of thing at a high level these days anymore. King f8 also went for a wave of popularity, just trying to go for some b6, bishop a6, and trade off the bishops, which is an idea we'll see in some of the more positional lines in the moment as well. But in the end, it just turns out white's just basically better in these positions. So there's no real kind of, great answer in a sense. But if they play a move like knight f3, then the b6 plans with, say, queen c7 and then b6 do tend to work a little bit better, where you could try to trade off the bishop and such. In fact, you could probably argue it may even be better just to play a move like b6 directly that you don't even need to prepare it. But anyway, those are some subtleties beyond the scope of the video. But probably the best line for white, to be fair, is actually the line with h4. This is one where I haven't really managed to find a way for black to equalize. And a big reason for this was because this game between Nepomniachtchi against MVL, like basically the idea is if you go take the pawns, white kind of just gets a bit too big of a lead in development in return. So black usually just tries to stabilize, but then there was this Nepo idea of just kind of going queen g4 and just making a point that's very hard for black to comfortably defend the pawn. Like all the different options kind of have their problems associated. I mean, modern just even kind of like some better approaches than this, but this is kind of the idea that really started to get people kind of looking at this as a way to get an advantage as white. And this is sort of the reason why I think the mainline Winawer, I think if you're like a professional player, probably wouldn't be my main recommendation. Because other lines like queen c7 and f5, they just end up being just really nice for white. Like not being able to attack the center later is actually quite a big problem for black here. And also the old hook variation with queen a5 that was kind of trendy in the 2000s. It just doesn't really work anymore. Like Indra just said, if you just go for this fawn-pawn plan again, then black's just going to have a lot of problems strategically speaking. So if you do want to play the Winawer, and you want to kind of play objectively the best lines, I think that the best option for black might actually be the line known as the Armenian variation with bishop to a5. It's a line that's been worked out quite a lot with engines, where it's actually black is somewhat close to equalizing. I don't think they fully equalize, moves like queen g4, for example, and dc5 do seem to give white some advantage here. But yeah, basically this is sort of like the main alter I recommend if you don't like the Winawer main lines. If they do play into the old main line of b4 and cd4, now it turns out black's position is actually not so bad. Like even though your king ends up on f8, which is not so great, you do have some counterplay based on some loose factors in the position. Like you can go after their pawn here and get some counterplay at the very least. Or if they play something a little bit more natural looking like knight b5 here, trying to sort of stabilize this way. This move of bishop d7 kind of turns out to be okay for black, because either you sort of recycle your bad bishop and just kind of have good squares for all the remaining pieces. Or if they do take to avoid that, you kind of have this bishop a4 where you sort of fix their queenside structure, and that kind of gives you like just enough play to basically be okay there. So that's a possible alternative. It does require a little bit of more memorization and some maybe stylish natural moves, but it is an option. It exists. Now, if they play bishop d2, I kind of like the move knight e7 in reply. Like if they go a3, which is sort of the main line these days, you can just go b6, trade off the bishop, and you're basically going to be okay there as black. There is an approach of knight b5 that's often suggested for club players, but I think that black just gets too quick a counterplay in a sense that you're just not really going to be able to keep that knight on d6, so it just falls a little bit flat in my opinion. You can also play a knight e7 move order if you do want to have some extra options against stuff like bishop to d2, but I do think you're probably just going to transpose most of the time anyway, because moves like b6, queen g4 are really not having a very good reputation for black. Now, if they go ed5, it's just a very simple position, like you can play pretty much any normal move basically and be fine here. The Alekan line with knight g2 is a little bit tricky, and if you want to avoid the sort of sharp fear I just showed you, this can be an interesting alternative. It was recommended, for instance, by Natalis in Reimagining e4, a book I like quite a lot. But in this case, objectively, black should be doing fine, like after knight c6. White does have a few options to play, like it does give you a bit of flexibility as white, which is quite nice. To be able to choose type position that you want. But after d5, yeah, if black knows the theory, they can eventually neutralize both queen a4, d1 and queen a4, like queen d4 is kind of a big equalizing idea for black there. But yeah, it's something you can do your own research on if you're so inclined. I do think the lines with bishop e7 give back the pawn. I do think they give white a little bit of an edge with the extra space, just kind of I think it's probably better just to take the pawn and, brave the complications. And finally, the one other line I'll mention, of course there are some other sidelines that we aren't able to get to in 10 minutes, but if they do play this a3 move, I think that it's just nothing really to be afraid of, just queen g8. knight d7, c5 in some order, and black is just basically totally fine in a position like this. Actually, to be fair, the Fury has kind of moved on. Like knight d7 was the old main line, but these days I kind of prefer to play a little bit more directly. So yeah, this is probably the way I'd recommend playing it in the modern era, where you're kind of negating bishop g5 a little bit in some cases with the pressure on the center. But anyway, that's all for this video. I hope that you enjoyed this coverage of the Winawer French from both sides' point of view, and just kind of showing the theoretical conclusions, the key ideas for both sides are worth knowing. But let me know in the comments below what was your favorite variation that we looked at within this spectrum of the Winawer French. And I will see you in the next video. Good luck with this opening in your own games, and take care.